talk about compression. So there's two ways that you can use compression, and for both of them, just use the compressor in your DAW. Once again, you don't need to go buy any fancy compressor. Everything you can just do with your built-in plugins. The only thing that your compressor needs to have is attack and release settings, and I've never seen a compressor that doesn't have those, so hopefully you don't either. They're a little bit tricky to get your head around, compressing and releasing that compression. Look up your compressor that you're using in your DAW on YouTube and watch a bunch of tutorials to get your head around it, because all of them have the same basic function, but their interfaces are a little bit whack sometimes. So what a compressor does is it squishes the sound. It grabs the sound and squishes it, and the two settings that you have with the compressor, the attack and release, will tell the compressor at what point to grab the sound and squish it, and then at what point to stop squishing it and let it go back to being its normal self. So the attack is how long it should wait until it starts its squishing. The release is how long it should hold onto it for before it releases it. There's often other settings which will affect the knee of the compression graph. Don't really worry about any of that, just worry about the attack and release. Some basic rules of thumb are you need to think about the instrument that you're compressing. So, for example, a drum kick has a lot of that initial impetus, that bah. So when you're compressing and you're squishing the sound, you need to think about, do I want to squish that bah, that initial bit, or do I want to squish that bah, that next bit that comes after that initial bah. So there's a bah, those bits together make that bah of the drum kick. So normally with the drums, you'll want the initial punchiness to come through and then compress the rest of it if you're wanting to compress it. Something else like vocals, often you'll want to compress the start of the vocals as well to smooth out the entire sound. So for example, la, if you want to compress that, you probably want that to sound smooth, so you'll compress it all evenly, and you'll hold that compression onto it for quite a while before you start unsquishing it, because squishing it all together will give it sort of an even, voluminous feel, the sound. Some vocals, like rap vocals, you don't want to do that because you have that initial like da 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 da. You have that punchiness that you want to come through. Sometimes you still want to put some compression on it to smooth out everything, but you'll maybe not grab that initial punchiness as much. Maybe you'll release it faster. So you want to tweak the settings depending on which instrument you're using. So with compression, the idea is to thicken the sound, and the best way to do this is to use several compressors in a row, each squishing it a little bit. Maybe you have different attack and release times on each of them, doesn't really matter. Do what you want with that, but you'll obviously have more control when you have 3 compressors in a row, and you can crank up the middle one, see what that does, because it's going to be compressed by the third one, including the information that the middle one's compressing, that's going to be compressed as well. So there's a lot more flexibility if you use more compressors. They will use a lot of CPU, so be aware of that. I have a cool tip here, which is to create 3 tracks of your instrument that you're going to be compressing. And for the first track, roll off the low sub 200, sub 500 frequencies, roll all that off, and roll off the high end, and just compress that middle bit. For the second one, compress the low bit. For the third one, compress the high bit. And now you will have the 3 parts of the spectrum that will together make up your instrument, but you'll have compression control over each of the 3 sections of the spectrum, so that's pretty cool. Whereabouts in the effect chain do we want this to sit? Do we want it before EQ or after EQ? Well, we talked about EQ, we want that before and after each of the audio effects. So we have our initial EQ, and then we can have compression. The general idea with compressions in the chain is any effect that doesn't add in new information into the sound, you should put a compressor afterwards. Or you can if you want. I would, and then you just have more control at each point of the chain, similar to EQing. The reason that you only want to do this when you haven't introduced new information is because if you add in information like with a reverb or something, and then you go and compress that reverb, what you're going to be doing is you're going to be grabbing that new information and that the reverb's introducing, so the reverb grabs the sound and adds this tail to it. You're going to be also grabbing that whole blob, so you're going to be grabbing that tail as well and compressing the whole thing and thickening the whole thing, including the tail, and you don't want to thicken the tail because any sort of information that you are introducing and then compressing is going to be, it's going to become overblown relative to the main sound that you started off with, which is dangerous because it means that if you tweak something else earlier on in the chain, it'll have a similar effect to having EQ on a master channel, and you won't quite know why it's making the sound turn the way it's turning, because that compression's working on that tail of the EQ, and maybe the sound that you're tweaking back there is affecting the tail of the EQ, but then you go change the compression because you think it's a compression, because you turn that off and it sounds fine, and then you're not sure what it is. So just avoid putting your compression on anything that introduces new information into your mix, into your track. Often it helps me to ask myself, what is the idea behind the effect that I'm thinking about compressing? So for example, with reverb, the idea is to maybe add space to the track or give it tone or some sort of distance introduction, and do I really want to be compressing that idea that I'm trying to add? Yeah, that's a good way of thinking about it. Should you use compression on your master channel? Absolutely not. If your track is having crest peak issues, go back, find the tracks that aren't quite punching in the way that you want, with too much of a peak and not enough of the follow-up, and go and add individual compression to that track. But yeah, don't just slap stuff on the master channel in general, that's a terrible idea. There is something I should mention, which is parallel compression. So you grab your track, you copy it, you crank up the compression on the track really high, drag the volume right down, and then slowly introduce it back into the mix until it's maybe like a quarter of the normal track volume, and it just adds a volume to the initial track that you don't normally get. Be careful of introducing like clicking and stuff like that with this new information, but in general it's a pretty cool technique. Other ways that you can add punchiness that you might be trying to do with a compressor is like limiters or saturation, upwards compression, which you don't really need to know about. It's just included in some compression packages, like Ableton's OTT does that upwards compression, but I wouldn't really bother learning about that. Yeah, upwards compression in general is a bit of a scam. It's like additive EQing, so it's trying to raise the volume of the channel instead of raising the volume of the channel and then removing the problem frequencies. So it's kind of doing it the wrong way around. Yeah, stay away from upwards compression. There's always better ways of doing it than upwards compressing.